In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Hi everybody. In this short video, we're going to be discussing the first of the seven sacraments, which is in no particular order, but the holy matrimony. We'll hopefully have a series of these videos where we can learn about the different sacraments of the Orthodox faith. We'll also be having a series of videos on the five pillars of faith as well. So we'll just go ahead and start. The main objectives of this video is to define the sacrament of marriage, discuss the institution of the sacrament, talk about what an Orthodox marriage looks like, and then we'll also talk about the outward sign and invisible grace. We'll discuss the obligations of the husband and wife in the biblical sense, and then kind of the expectations from a husband and wife before marriage, at marriage, and after marriage. So I think it's important at the beginning to discuss what a sacrament is, because obviously we're talking about one of the seven sacraments, and a sacrament is really a visible form of an invisible grace. And sometimes sacrament is called a door. And you can pause this video if you're watching it with a group to discuss why you think it would be called a door. So a sacrament is called a door because it's really the gateway to be able to attain something very, very special. And so a door is something that we see, and when someone goes through the door, they're actually able to attain something that is not able to be seen. So an invisible grace. So the door is the actual sacrament, something that we see, that we go through, that we perform, or it's something that is performed for us or upon us. And when someone goes through that door or completes that sacrament, then they attain an invisible grace. And so that is the case with all the other sacraments as well, such as the sacrament of the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, the sacrament of baptism, the sacrament of the confirmation. So we'll talk about the other ones as well, but obviously for this particular video, we're going to be focused on the sacrament of holy matrimony. So I think it's important to realize that marriage is beyond just a union of between a man and a woman. It's really sanctified and it's projected unto the kingdom of heaven. Marriage is also a symbolic of another very important relationship between our Lord Jesus Christ and the church. And one of the verses that we'll kind of bring up later on as well is a verse that says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." And we'll talk about the concept of submission later on, but the focus for now is the fact that the Bible actually shows us the relationship between the church and Jesus Christ is an important kind of comparison between the relationship between a husband and a wife. Another verse says, "Husbands, love your wives just as the Lord Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." And both of these verses are found in Ephesians. So, question: who instituted or created marriage? This is a question that comes up. There's a lot of discussion about what marriage is and in the current society, and I think it's very, very important to understand who actually created and instituted marriage. And we find the answer that marriage is actually instituted by God, and proof of that is in Genesis chapter 1, verses 27 and 28. So that verse says, "God created man in his own image and likeness. In the image and likeness of God created he them. Male and female created he them. And God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and stock up the earth." Another key verse is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22 through 24. And this is really an important verse because this sort of shows us how God instituted the sacrament of matrimony on Adam and Eve, the first human beings. "Then the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And this is really the time that we see how Adam and Eve were united through the grace of God, and they become one. And this is the first example that shows clearly shows us how God instituted the sacrament of marriage, and you can see how He defined it, how He instituted, and so when we have discussions about what marriage is, and discussions in the current day about marriage equality and things like that, I think it's very important to realize and to understand historically and biblically where marriage came from and what marriage is. So I think it's very, very important to understand that. Another important verse that shows us, how marriage was instituted and created by God is in Matthew chapter 19, when the Pharisees asked Christ, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And Christ says to them, "Have you not read that He who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So this is in the text in the blue, they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." So this is so important to realize again. In marriage, it is God who actually joins the husband and wife, and in this mystery, in this sacrament, they become one. And so that's we're focused on that. So what is, I think it's important to realize that we're discussing these seven sacraments and this holy matrimony in the context of the orthodoxy. So what does an orthodox marriage look like? So one is no mixed marriage, two is monogamy, and three is no divorce allowed unless there's cheating involved. And all of these are things that are biblical, and we'll view them one by one. So one is no mixed marriages. So really, if someone is outside of the Orthodox faith, marriage with that person is really not going to work out. And we'll sort of talk about why this is sort of going to make a few people uncomfortable. But again, the purpose for this video is to kind of educate so people know, not necessarily to make people comfortable. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 14 through 16 says, "Do not be equally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial?" Belial, by the way, is the name for basically the devil or an evil spirit. "What part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temples of the living God." Okay, so it's very important. So this verse clearly shows us that don't be yoked or don't be united or don't be joined, especially in marriage, with those who are unbelievers. And some of you are probably reading this thinking, well, what's wrong if I married a Christian? Do they have to be Orthodox? And that is going to be a very, very common question that we ask, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I think first let's talk about the importance of marrying someone who does believe in God. So let's just focus on that, and we'll get to that second question, the burning question, in a little bit. So God obviously needs to be part of our marriage. So a marriage with someone who is an unbeliever will not work. And obviously, marriage is a very important part of our lives, and there are obviously other parts of our life as well. And whenever we have God, which is kind of symbolized in this funnel that's protecting the different aspects of someone's life, whenever there are trials and tribulations, which are symbolized by the red arrows, it'll be protected. So including the marriage, you'll be protected. However, if we have marriage that is not protected, it would certainly will be destroyed during times of trouble. And so that's very, very important to realize. So God needs to be a part of our marriage, and that's, I think, if you're watching this video, you probably realize that that's not something that is very difficult to understand. All right, so now we're gonna get to that important question that we talked about earlier. What does the verse "the two shall become one flesh" truly mean? So the question to think about here, if you want to pause the video to discuss, is if they, meaning the husband and wife, have become one flesh, can they be led by two different faiths, two different heads? And I think that's a very important question. So this is a obviously probably causes a little bit of a controversy or discussion, but I think hopefully that we can come to a conclusion. And again, the purpose of this video is not necessarily to convince you one way or another about this way of Christianity versus that. But I hope you realize that, at least in the context of Orthodoxy, what the church teaches is that, when a husband and wife are joined together and they become one, that really becomes like it's one person. And, one person can't really have two different paths or two different faiths or two different churches that they go to. It just does not work when we're talking about one person and one flesh. And so if it doesn't work for one person, one single person, it does not work for husband and wife. And again, I know that's not a popular thing to say, but again, this is not about saying the most popular thing, but saying the right thing and saying the truth. There are just a few verses here that shows kind of um, uh, this specific idea. One is in Joshua 24:15, when he says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, showing that one family is really supposed to have one faith, and it does not make sense for one family to serve two masters, two lords, two different faiths. It does not work. Another important verse is the story of the Samaritan woman. You can read the detailed story in John chapter 4, but Jesus Christ, before he goes further with the Samaritan woman in the story, he says to her, "Go call your husband and come here." And it's very interesting that Christ wants to involve the husband. Now, granted, later on we figure out more detail about that piece, but the reason why Christ asks her to bring her husband is because he wants to teach them the truth, the way, the true Christianity, the true path. He wants to teach them together, because again, you cannot have a marriage where one person believes in one thing and another person believes in a different thing. It does not work, just like it doesn't work for one person. All right, so if there are further questions about this specific concept, feel free to send me a message or put it in the comments and we can address it. Moving on to the second characteristic of an Orthodox marriage is monogamy. So let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. And that verse is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Oh, sorry about that. It specifically says that divorce is not allowed. Divorce is not allowed. And the verse for that is, so then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So it's very, very important in the Orthodox Church. So moving on to another concept, which is, what are the goals of marriage? What are the goals of marriage? So there are three things. One is preserving mankind. Two is helping each other. And three is to stay away from sinful temptations or lust. So as far as preserving mankind, so this was God's command to Adam and Eve, Genesis chapter 1. So we've already talked about this verse earlier, but the part in red is what I want you to focus on, which says, be fruitful and multiply. He says to them, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so again, that's an important piece, is to continue the generation, to preserve mankind. I've heard some husband and wife saying, I don't want to have any kids. That's I just and that's really not it does not work, because that kind of misses one of the most important reasons why a husband and wife get married, is to have children. The second reason is for helping each other. And so in Genesis chapter 2, we see in the Bible that God says, it is not good for a man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. And this sometimes gets misunderstood by some people. Why is the woman called a helper? I chose this picture on purpose because I wanted to show that they should be helping each other, and it's not just the woman that's supposed to be helping the man, but obviously the man is supposed to be helping the woman as well. We'll talk about this more in detail, but just understand that concept that they are there to help each other and to be supportive companions for the rest of their lives. The third reason why marriage is very, very important, or the purpose of marriage, is to stay away from sinful temptations, mainly lust. And so, an important verse to understand is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 9. And I'll go through this verse and talk about what it means. First, I'm going to read it. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to those widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. All right, so a lot of things going on in this verse, kind of confusing. Okay, starts off by saying it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, so this idea of purity, in this day and age, it's not a very popular concept. There are a lot of people who don't understand why, some people in our church, choose a monastic life or choose a life of purity, basically saying that they prefer not to get married, and they kind of want to die from this world and serve God, and live in prayer for the rest of their lives. And that is really actually highly unpopular by a lot of people in today's day and age. But this verse clearly illustrates that if we could be strong, like our father Paul, if we could be strong, that actually is preferred. So he starts off by saying, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, is this saying that is he against marriage? No. Is he saying that, a healthy sexual relationship between a husband and wife is a bad thing? No. And that's because of what is in red. So it's, there's the first verse there, and the second verse says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, which is a huge problem, right? Huge problem. Let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. So this verse shows us the third and important reason why a husband and wife get married is to stay away from sexual immorality, because obviously a sexual relationship outside of marriage is not acceptable. That is what this is telling us, that a husband and a wife should be married. A woman and a man should be married prior to engaging in any sexual activity, and this is the verse that tells us that. And so then the next, verse 3, again verse 4, verse 3 and 4 pretty much tell us that, the once husband and wife are married, they should not and cannot really deny themselves a sexual relationship. And obviously the husband and wife need to work through a lot of those issues, and it's a very personal and kind of between them two. But what this verse is telling us is that because of the problem with sexual immorality, because of infidelity, it's important that both the husband and wife are willing to give that to each other. And so that's what it's saying. A very important verse. Verse 5 again says that, do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Again, this is important. So a husband and wife can agree at certain times, certain fasting seasons, certain prayer times, to say, we're not going to have any relation during this period of time, so we can both fast and get spiritually strong, and not necessarily give to our fleshly desires. And so I think this is very, very important. But I think verse 6 is confuses some people. But it says, "But I say this as a concession and not as a commandment." He's basically saying, "I'm not saying you've got to get married. I'm not saying that." And he says, "I wish that that every man was like me." And he's not saying this with pride, but he's just saying, like, I wish we could all kind of work on being pure and not necessarily have to engage in sexual relations. But then he says, however, each man, each woman we all have our different gifts that we've gotten from God, and so that's sort of what he's talking about. And then so it says, verse 8. You can read verse 8, verse 9. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. And then the last verse, the last part of verse 9 is very important. And it says, "For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." And that verse is always stuck in my mind. It's always a verse that I tell to a lot of my friends, who ask the question, when am I too young to get married? Am I too young to get married? Because a lot of people want to have their finances straightened out first, and they want to buy a house first, and they want to move out of their parents' house, and they want to graduate from college, which I think all of those things are very, very important, and I think people need to make decisions in a very thoughtful manner. However, I always tell people, even if someone is, relatively young for what society feels as though, marriage should be at a certain age, if there are two Christian man and woman, and even though in the worldly sense they may not be quote unquote ready for marriage, which I think, there are things that need to be ready first, I do think that this verse is very important. It is better to marry than to burn with passion. Because what happens when you burn with passion eventually is it leads to fornication, it leads to premarital sex, and it leads to infidelity, and it leads to a lot of unhealthy sexual sins. It really does. And so, I think the Bible also is really illustrating St. Paul here, saying that it is better to marry than to be in this situation. However, if someone can exercise self-control, then and if they're able to wait to get the finances straightened out and to graduate and to those things, then I think obviously anybody would prefer that. But I do always like to make sure that people know that this is an important reason. Staying away from sinful temptations is a very, very important reason why a husband and wife get married. Okay, so I just want to highlight that. Back to these pictures, you can see crowns being placed on heads, and those crowns actually represent symbolism of it symbolized the reward given to martyrdom. And basically, in marriage, it's very, very important to try to stay pure as much as possible, which is very, very difficult to do, and it does take a lot of self-control. And so that level of sacrifice in the church is seen as important as a martyr sacrifice. And so that's sort of the reason why crowns are given, to symbolize that, the reward of martyrdom. The other thing that's done is meron, or holy oil. So the husband and wife are anointed with the holy oil, or the meron, which is a symbol of sanctification by the Holy Spirit. And this is the same type of oil that God used to anoint and bless the chosen prophets and kings. And there's a lot of examples in the Bible where Samuel and David were anointed with this holy oil, and to give them a certain kind of position again. And so the husband and wife are also anointed with this oil as they start their very special journey together, as united, as they become one flesh and start their lives together as man and wife. All right. So this is a verse that's often used in the church during the matrimony service. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 verse 12, which says, "A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." So what does this verse mean to you? You can pause this video to discuss. So this verse, hopefully most of you are able to figure it out, that the 3 strands of the cord represents the husband, the wife, and God. And this verse really is used sometimes to talk about a husband, a wife, and God. And when God is kind of in the middle as that third strand, um, then the husband and wife will really are able to withstand a lot of the temptations and a lot of the trials and tribulations that come with marriage, which there are definitely a lot of. And so I think it's important to always keep God in the center of marriage. All right. And so through this entire process of the things that we see that we just talked about, we're hoping to attain the invisible grace, which is basically this process allows us a lot, basically sanctifies the marriage to make it more spiritual. It also helps unite the husband and wife, as well as keeping the husband and wife faithful. So sanctifying it to make the marriage spiritual. This verse in Hebrews chapter 13 verse 4 says, "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge." Again, marriage is something that is honorable. It is an honorable thing in the eyes of God. And then the 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verse 3 to 4 says, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess sanctification and honor." So you can see that the process of the sacrament allows the marriage to truly be honorable and allows God to enter as that third chord. Grand. Again, another thing that we're hoping to attain is the unification of the husband and wife. And so I use this picture. I really like it, which shows the husband and the wife are kind of bringing their own half pieces, and they really become united. And again, we talked about this verse in Matthew chapter 19 earlier. I just want to highlight where it says, "What God has joined together, let not man separate." And so keeping that in mind, that this sacrament allows the husband and wife to become one flesh. Okay, so what is expected from the husband and wife? So before the wedding, really both should be Christians, both should belong to an Orthodox church. They should not have any other relationships, and they should be willing to get married. Okay. So another question to ask is, this is a beautiful scene in a marriage, a wedding ceremony at the beach, and it looks really breathtaking. But where should a marriage be performed? So the actual marriage, holy matrimony, and hopefully you guys understand and realize that although this is absolutely beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, the marriage needs to be performed at a church. And I cannot emphasize that enough. And many people, from not knowing, they will plan these beautiful weddings and sort of invite someone to come and perform the wedding. And that works from a legal perspective, but from a spiritual perspective, you really do need to make it in a church, and then kind of go through the actual sacrament and the actual prayers, and then seal it really with the Holy Communion, by uniting Jesus Christ and God as part of that marriage, and making him that important piece of the strand. And so that can't happen in front of the beach. Although you can have a reception at the beach, the actual marriage, holy matrimony ceremony needs to happen in the beach. Question: So, what is the role of the husband? Uh, in the Christian sense, the role of the husband. Um, so, what do you guys think? So, the role of the husband. So, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. So, husbands need to love their wives. Now, there are a lot of things husbands need to do, and we can certainly talk about that. But the number one responsibility that the Bible gives to husbands is for them to love their wives. And love, the way we're talking about it is not in the sense of a feeling, but it's really an action. And so it gives us an example of what Christ did, because he loved the church and he died for the church. He gave himself up for her. And so a husband also needs to do the same thing. Oftentimes, when I have this discussion with people, the question comes up of, like, what does that actually mean? What does death mean? And many men have this sense of chivalry in their minds, and they think, I would die for my wife if something came up. If I was in a battlefield, or if somebody came, a burglary came, I would die for my wife. But truth be told, most people are probably not going to be in that circumstance. Most people are probably not going to have, quote unquote, an opportunity to die for their wives. But what really, there was someone who taught me a very important lesson, which is, but there are little daily deaths that a husband could die for his wife. And so that sounds kind of weird, but what does that mean? So let's say the husband, so I'm talking to the men now. So you come home, you're extremely tired and you're extremely exhausted. You had a long day from work, and your wife also had, a long day from work. You're both sitting down, and she says, I really want a glass of orange juice. And she can go get it herself because she's closer to the fridge, but she's looking at you and asking you to get that orange juice. And it's probably going to be very painful to get up from that couch just when your favorite TV show or basketball game is about to come on. But that sacrifice you make to say, what, I'm going to put her first. I'm going to put her first. I'm going to get up right now. I'm going to get her that orange juice. And when you're up, she might say, while you're up, why don't you warm up dinner? And doing that as well, that right there is what it's talking about, giving yourself up for the wife. Truly giving up and truly making the wife number one. And, not number one, really, God should be number one. But making her come before, making her needs come before your needs is very, very important, and that's really what the Bible teaches us. So the next question is, what is the role of the wife? When I showed this video to my students the first time, this picture caught them off guard. So what does this mean? Am I advocating that the role of the wife is to cook for her husband and to clean, and that's it? So I purposely chose this video for just so that you guys can discuss, but really, so to kind of hopefully have a discussion on this concept of submission. So the Bible teaches us, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself its Savior, in Ephesians chapter 5. So wives need to submit. So do husbands need to submit? They do. But the number one thing they need to do is love. So for husbands, the priority is love, which means loving to death and action. And then they also should submit themselves. Okay? Wives, then they need to love their husbands? Yes, they do need to love their husbands. But the number one thing they need to do is submit themselves to their husbands. Now, in today's day and age, this is not a popular concept whatsoever. However, it's important to understand what this concept is saying. And the concept is, again, trying to highlight that relationship between the church and Jesus Christ. The church gladly, happily submits herself to Christ, who is her protector, her lover, and her head. Okay, her leader, basically. And this is sort of the same relationship between a husband and wife. It is not saying that the husband can abuse this privilege and this opportunity. That's not the point. In fact, I would argue that the husband's responsibility, if it's truly carried out the way the Bible intended to mean, the husband's responsibility should be much, much, much harder than the wife's responsibility. Although a lot of people may argue the opposite because of the mentality, the psyche of today's youth and today's society. So submission, many people might argue, many people may say it's not equal. However, again, we're not saying that the husband's not supposed to submit, and the husband's not supposed to do what the wife wants him or her to do, or wants what. I'm not advocating that the wife is not supposed to do, or the husband is not supposed to do what the wife wants him to do. All we're saying here is that the Bible teaches us submission, just like the church submits to Christ. Okay, willingly, happily, and and also expect something, right? And just like Christ provides for the church and dies for the church and protects and does anything for the church, the husband should do the same as well. Okay, so submission does not mean cooking every morning and cleaning and being a slave to the husband. And so I put this picture to say some people misunderstand this verse submission and use it in the wrong sense and understand it in the wrong sense and they say, it's not 1950s. You know, I am going to work and I'm going to be living equally as my husband, and that is perfectly acceptable. And however, it's very important to understand this idea of submission, and it's when we all have a perspective of really a Christian way of thinking. So it's really an attitude adjustment first to be able to even begin to understand, and then once we've had that attitude adjustment and have the correct perspective, and then we're able to really understand this idea of submission, this idea of the husband being the head and the wife submitting, is something that Christian women are able to gladly accept. Again, if there are any questions about this concept, I'm more than happy to discuss further. So you guys can just post your questions down below. We actually have gotten to the end of our discussion on the holy matrimony. Please post your questions and your comments down below. And thank you, and God bless.
ይህን ልዩ ፍቅር